on obstacles to getting paid, protecting your revenue. This webinar is led by us. So Stacy's going to walk us through the content. She's our Retail Insights VP. So that means she's over the Retail Insights managers, which means basically that what she's doing is trying to kind of put herself in your shoes as much as she can to try to understand what are the kind of barriers to supplier success at these major retailers. And what are the kind of new maybe compliance issues that are showing up out of nowhere? You know, what are the new things Walmart is doing, or Target, or whoever? And I am a similar kind of situation, but I'm on the supplier wiki team. So we're just here to kind of generate the wiki, create as much content as possible that can be beneficial to you guys. So that's what we're here to do. That's what we do at SupplyPike. But today we're going to be talking about kind of just revenue loss at a high level with a little bit more of a Walmart bend and a Walmart focus. As we'll get to on our SupplyPike slide, we'll talk a little bit about our history. Yeah, we grew up here in Walmart's backyard, and so there's very much a bias in that direction. But whatever questions or comments you have about other major retailers that you would like to kind of bring to this conversation would be much appreciated for that reason too. So we'll start with a little bit of benchmarking, which could be good to just to give some of you a little bit of a sense of where you stand relative to competitors or to the kind of industry standards, right? And then we'll get into a lot of Walmart in our next two sections, some of the most common points of revenue loss in Walmart, and then comparing that across different sections as well, with benchmarking that particular revenue, those particular forms of revenue loss. And then we're going to talk about something we're really passionate about, which is trying to put a positive spin on things a little bit. How can we turn these, let's call them difficult compliance programs or difficult standard regimens that different retailers have for their suppliers into something that is business positive. And that's what we'll be really kind of covering in the last couple sections here as well, before we do a Q&A at the end. All right, these are a bunch of the FAQs we normally get. You will be getting a copy of the slide deck, so you don't need to be too kind of taking such kind of vigorous notes, or taking screenshots before we switch to the next slide. You can download a copy of the slide deck in about 3 to 4 days after we do it. We're also uploading these webinars to YouTube. So if you haven't subscribed to the SupplyPike YouTube channel, I highly recommend that, just to kind of keep aware of what's going on that we do. And then also there's a difference between the Q&A tab and the chat. The chat is for public comments, for letting us know what your favorite holiday is. Are you a pre-Thanksgiving Christmas tree person or post-Thanksgiving Christmas tree person? That kind of stuff. As well as if we ask a kind of public question, like, does this benchmarking make sense with what you've seen at your business or stuff like that, right? So that's the public kind of conversations. But for the Q&A, we tend to get a lot of questions, so we prefer for people to put them into the Q&A tab itself, so that we can kind of do triage with figuring out, okay, is this question better suited for earlier on in the presentation, or should we save it for the Q&A time at the end? And that way we can also make sure that we don't miss anyone's questions in the chat. So yeah, that's that. Little bit about who we are. I mentioned this a little bit before. We grew up in Walmart's backyard, so our main thing that we got started doing was AP deductions at Walmart. But we've now expanded kind of well beyond that. So here are some of our partners that we're really happy with, that we love working with, that we're really proud of. And here's just some numbers to give you a little bit of a sense of where we are kind of relative to other SaaS companies in this industry. But our main goal is basically just that, to be a SaaS company that is helping particularly with revenue loss. It started out with AP deductions, but as you'll see kind of throughout this webinar, we're really trying to treat revenue loss like a science, like something that can be explored, that we can shore up all of the different forms of it, and give people insight into that, and in the long term help people avoid that altogether. So that's kind of what our product does a little bit. If you're interested in that, let us know in the chat, and we can give you all a little bit of a preview at the end if that's something y'all would be interested in. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Stacy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. Appreciate it. And super excited to kind of walk through this deck with you guys. It is chock full of some pretty interesting information. As Peter mentioned, we are consider ourselves very lucky to work with about 500 different CPG suppliers today. And so we've got some pretty interesting data out there that hopefully, as Peter mentioned, you'll be able to kind of figure out where you fit in the grand scheme of things. And hey, are you doing great? Or is this something that maybe, hey, we can make it a big focus on for 2024? So we wanted to go ahead and kind of kick us off with just a little bit of information, just to kind of set the stage for you guys on general industry numbers. Just again, so you all have context into, how big of a problem deductions can be for some suppliers at the different retailers that you might be in. So as Peter mentioned, we did start with supporting just Walmart and Walmart Inc., so Walmart and Sam's Club, but we have since expanded to also support Target, Kroger, and Amazon, which is why we've got a little bit of data about those retailers as well. So just to give you guys a little bit of context, in general, these are the timelines, kind of the statute of limitations, so to speak, that all the retailers give to their suppliers to dispute. Now, your mileage may vary depending on the different types of deductions that are out there. But generally speaking, if you have an AP deduction, which is basically any sort of short payment off of an invoice, this is how much time you have to go after each one. So with Walmart, the standard expectation is about 2 years. So obviously they give suppliers kind of the longest amount of time. For Target, it's about 18 months, so about 1.5 years. With Kroger, 180 days. And with Amazon, crazy enough, suppliers really have about 30 days to go after AP deductions. Now, to kind of give you guys a little bit of context from the suppliers that we support, this is about the average of what we see from the time a deduction is submitted to the time it is actually approved by the supplier. Now, we like to call out, of course, that this is average. So you are definitely going to have some situations where you get approved the next day, which I know feels shocking, but it really does happen. But you will also have some deduction disputes that are out there for, months and months and months. So for the retailers that we support, again, this is the average that we see from the time a dispute is submitted to approved. With Kroger, it's about 73 days, and they have their own nuances there. We have a lot of Kroger webinars. So if you guys find Kroger as one of your bigger pain points, please feel free to check out our YouTube channel that Peter mentioned. You'll see a lot of webinars dedicated to Kroger, but about 73 days. For Walmart, it's about 51 days, which, has been a little bit longer lately with settlement going away. And we've got a couple of slides on that that we'll give you guys some updates on in a second. With Amazon, it's about 35 days. And with Target, it's about 25 days. And again, each of these has its own little nuance with it. So for example, for Target, their deductions team actually has an SLA of about service level agreement of about 30 days. And so with them, you will actually get responses really, really fast. But a lot of times what we see happens is you'll get a false negative. Basically, they will deny your dispute because they have to get to it within a certain time frame. So they'll just go ahead and deny it, and say, hey, we don't approve this. We're not going to get you paid back without necessarily reviewing the proof. And suppliers then have to kind of turn around and redispute it. So crazy enough for Target, we see that suppliers actually have to redispute a deduction on average about 2 to 3 times in order to get repaid. So if you guys are in Target today and kind of in charge of the deduction process and you're getting denials on your dispute at Target, and obviously there are situations where sometimes it's valid, and you're like, hey, I really did short ship, that was our bad. But if you know that they're invalid, I would really, really recommend making sure that you have a process in place to redispute those, because Target has its own little quirks. So yeah, I'm not going to spend too long on each of these retailers, just because, as I mentioned, we have a lot of content on our YouTube channel on Supplier Wiki where you guys can deep dive into any of these. And we only have an hour with you guys today, so I want to make sure that we can get through all of the content in time. So As Peter mentioned, we're going to focus a little bit more for this section of the webinar on kind of Walmart revenue loss. Again, just because we have a limited amount of time with you guys. So hopefully this is helpful for you. We find for a lot of the suppliers that we work with, Walmart is often kind of the big gorilla in the room, so to speak. They will make up the largest size of the business and therefore the largest amount of kind of deductions and rev loss related pain. So we're focusing on them for today, but I know I'm a broken record. If you guys want to have other, want to get into content for the other retailers, again, feel free to check out the other material that we have on Supplier Wiki. But anyway, so we always like to kind of set the stage and make sure that we're all talking about the same information when we are, thinking about revenue loss at Walmart, just because a lot of times different companies may call buckets of revenue loss different things. But we think it's really important to kind of understand kind of the four main ways that Walmart takes your revenue, unfortunately. And we think it's important to understand them because each bucket will have its own nuance to understand, number one, how you can even just plain get that money back, but also number two, understand why you're losing that money in the first place. So generally speaking, we think revenue loss falls into kind of the four main buckets. And if you guys have different buckets, please feel free to share that in the chat as well. I think it's always great for us to learn from each other. But generally speaking, you have your invoice deductions. These are, again, generally going to be deductions that you are not necessarily expecting or planning for. So things like shortages, damages, substitutions, pricing discrepancies, duplicate billing. So, hey, Walmart orders 100 cases, you ship 100 cases. They say they only received 80 cases, and so they ding you with a shortage. So that is not necessarily something you plan for, but obviously a very, very common occurrence that we see for the suppliers that we work with. Another type of revenue loss bucket that we see a lot with our suppliers is the negotiated or the expected bucket. So again, in our example, invoice deductions are like, hey, we didn't expect this was coming, but we got it, and now we have to figure out how to fight it. A lot of times, many suppliers will have negotiated revenue loss, and these will come in the form of allowances, as an example of, oh, hey, we are expecting a 1% warehouse allowance because that was built into our online supplier agreement with Walmart. So when they take 1%, we expect that, and that's great. So you have things like allowances, promotions, co-ops, coupons, and cash discounts. But I'm sure if you guys are in charge of revenue at your company, a lot of times Walmart will take more than what they negotiated as well. So, hey, we agreed to run a promotion with Walmart for 1 month at $1 each per item that is sold, and Walmart ended up taking $2 for each item, or Walmart ended up running that promotion for 2 months instead of 1 month, and now we need to go and fight that charge because they took more than what we expected. So just an example of a negotiated type of rev loss that sometimes may not even then fall into what you expected to see. Another common bucket that we see are the compliance fines. So this is more on the kind of arbitrary rules and programs that Walmart puts together, and they will set rules and expectations and basically say, for example, for on time in full, hey, we expect our suppliers to be 98% on time and 98% in full because we say so. If you want to be a supplier with Walmart, that is the expectation. And so these are the fines that you get when you fall out of compliance with these programs. So, hey, you were 90% on time instead of 98% on time, and therefore Walmart is going to slap a 3% cost of goods sold fine for any non-compliant case. So that is just another way that you can lose revenue at Walmart. And then the last kind of, again, general bucket that you see is the audits. So if any of you guys have done any sort of business with Walmart, I am sure you've gotten a post-audit email at some point in your career. And when you see that number, you're like, what is happening? But of course, it is a way that Walmart utilizes to kind of help true up or maybe sweep through anything that they think that they should have gotten but missed in any of these previous buckets. So at a high level, these are kind of the big four ways that a lot of suppliers that we work with typically will lose revenue at Walmart. So I think one thing that we also like to call out for our suppliers is at Walmart, there is the concept of stacking fines. So a single issue, legitimate or not, and we can wax poetic about the validity or invalidity of deductions and things like that, can lead to multiple deductions and fines. So as an example, if you have an item setup issue, let's say your vendor pack and your warehouse pack were not set up correctly, and you set it up as a 12/1 instead of a 12/12, or whatever it is, that can lead to, a shortage deduction because they receive it incorrectly at the DC, an OTIF in full fine, and even a SQEP fine. And I think one thing that a lot of, especially newer suppliers, aren't aware of is, these are three separate kind of departments in Walmart. And so they kind of operate completely independently. So you can get, again, these three different fines or shortages for a single issue on a single item, and basically be responsible for having to fight each and every single one. We do call out that the kicker is that every fine or shortage deduction that you receive has to be fought separately. So we get questions, again, from a lot of newer suppliers with us that will go, okay, well, I got a shortage. It was incorrect. I showed Walmart that I actually shipped the product in full. Is that going to go ahead and reverse that OTIF in full fine for me? Because, Walmart themselves said that my shortage was invalid. And sadly, the answer is no. So if you do get multiple deductions or fines on a single PO or a single item, you have to go into every individual portal to fight them separately. And you can't necessarily use a shortage reversal as proof for an OTIF fine reversal, which is crazy. But that is, the reality of the situation, which is why, again, at SupplyPike, we're really, really, really big fans of understanding the rules of the game. Because if you understand the rules of the game, you understand how your money is being taken and how you can fight it, we believe you can be better positioned to actually not only go after that money, but also kind of reduce the inflow of deductions and fines in the future. So along with that, wanted to give you guys a couple of quick updates for, those of you who have maybe done business with Walmart for a little bit. So one of the big updates on the AP deduction side is the settlement program has officially gone away as of May 2023. So for those of you guys who maybe were on the settlement program before, and maybe this is newer news to you, and just to give you all a little bit of context, Walmart used to have something called quarterly settlements, where they would basically work with usually mid-sized to larger suppliers and go, hey, rather than you having to individually dispute every deduction you receive, why don't we agree on a quarterly basis that we were probably wrong a little bit, you were probably wrong a little bit, so let's agree that we're going to go ahead and settle and pay you back 85% of the deductions you received. And suppliers could basically negotiate and go, no, we don't think that's fair. We totally ship this in full. You should pay us back for 95%, and they'll come back with 90 or whatever it is. And that was very, very helpful and very efficient, again, for those mid-size and larger suppliers, because they could basically settle their deductions in bulk and go, hey, everything from Q1 of this year, we're going to go ahead and agree on a percentage, and that is it. And we can kind of close the books on that and call it done. But as of May 1st, as I mentioned, Walmart has officially sunset that program. And now all suppliers, regardless of size, have to utilize the APDP portal, or the Accounts Payable Dispute portal, to basically send in disputes individually. So in an effort to kind of counter and find a midway step, Walmart did introduce a concept called MDC, or the mass dispute creation. And the idea behind it is, you could submit up to 500 disputes at a time. So they're like, hey, we took settlement away, but no worries, because you can now submit 500 disputes at a time. You're good. But what they failed to kind of call out and make available is that MDC actually does not allow you to submit proof documentation. So again, if you guys own this function at your company, you know that anytime you need to submit a dispute with Walmart, you essentially have to show them, if it's a shortage, hey, we really did ship this in full, or if it's a pricing discrepancy, you have to show them kind of item setup information. But MDC does not allow that. So what we actually found, we see millions of disputes kind of yearly because of the number of suppliers we work with. We see on average suppliers utilizing MDC only have about an 8% success rate, which is crazy low. So for those that were kind of used to that 80 to 90% success rate on settlement and then switched to MDC, saw that drop precipitously down to 8%. And that was really, really painful for a lot of suppliers. And if that's something you guys are going through, just know you're not alone. And so for those kind of remaining 92% that did not get approved on average, suppliers are still having to manually redispute them one by one with proof anyway. So kind of a painful process. Again, it was supposed to help, didn't really help. So again, for those of you guys who maybe are newer to the world of disputing, newer to Walmart, maybe you just got off settlement program, what we have found, generally speaking, is that disputing manually is pretty tedious. It takes quite a bit of expertise, as we mentioned, multiple different portals that you have to understand and get to. So generally speaking, suppliers are having to use about 3 different applications. So usually a combination of APIS, APDP, and DSS, soon to be Luminate, to research, collect proof, and dispute. And it takes about 20 minutes for every dispute. Obviously, we have some folks that have been doing this for a long time and they can get it down to about 5 minutes. But if this is not your day-to-day and you're just coming in when you have time, it does take 20 minutes to kind of refamiliarize yourself with the systems, know where to get all the documents you need, and then actually key in the dispute and submit it. And then just so y'all have context, for Walmart, there are about 50 to 75 different deduction codes that are relevant for different suppliers, depending on size. And so you have to essentially know how to dispute, what type of documentation is needed, what sort of data is needed to dispute almost every single one of these different codes. So unfortunately, it is a pretty painful process. And then another quick update. So that's on the AP side. So again, that's off invoice. So, hey, you invoice Walmart for, $1,000 and they don't pay you in full. And, that is more on the AP side. On the compliance fine side, just, some quick updates for you guys there. So OTIF standards are continuing to remain high. So we have begun to heard rumblings that the 98% may be adjusted in 2024, but please don't quote us on that. Obviously, once we know more, we will definitely be sharing that out with the larger supplier community as a whole. But as of today, it is still at that 98%, expectation. I think kind of the bigger pain point that we've seen for a lot of suppliers lately has been SQEP, or the Supplier Quality Excellence Program. So OTIF's been around for about 5 or 6 years now. And so a lot of suppliers have it's not great, but I think we've all adjusted to and gotten used to it. But for SQEP, that is newer. That was introduced in 2021. And that is more around, so obviously OTIF is around on time and full, making sure products show up, at whichever DCs they need to, complete and when they're expected. SQEP is more around kind of things like barcode compliance, case quality, load quality, pallet quality, and things like that. So Walmart has already released 3 out of 4 phases, and there are about 60 different defects that you can get fined for under the SQEP program. And so I would say if you guys are not currently checking your SQEP scores, I wouldn't make that a priority. We've got some really interesting stats out there basically showing essentially 98% of the suppliers that we've worked with has gotten at least 1 SQEP fine in the last 12 months. And for about 1/3 of the suppliers we work with, SQEP fines have actually exceeded OTIF fines. And we think that this is going to continue to get worse as they roll out phase 4 potentially next year, and then also just continue to, invest into this program. So there is a SQEP application in RetailLink. We also have, again, a lot of webinars around this, so I won't spend too much time on it. But I would really, really recommend checking that out in case you guys, haven't really been looking at that recently. So SQEP app and the Fixit app are both kind of sister applications that you should have access to in RetailLink. Okay, so now we've kind of set the stage into the different ways Walmart can take money. And also, just giving you guys a couple of quick updates that we've seen that maybe you guys have missed since you all have day-to-day jobs. We wanted to give you some interesting benchmarking data. Again, Peter mentioned it earlier on the webinar today, but sometimes it's really nice to understand where you fit in the grand scheme of things, to go, hey, we're really, really killing it on, our days to dispute, but maybe maybe the inflow of deductions that we're receiving is really not very healthy, and we want to try and be, you know, kind of best in class. So hopefully this data is helpful for you guys. As Peter mentioned, you'll have access to this deck after our call today. But obviously, if you guys have any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A or reach out to us after this. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have. So we gathered company or data again from about 500 different companies, over 50 different categories at Walmart. And generally, we tried to categorize them into these 6 categories. So you have the less than 25 million, so kind of the small companies. And this is in net ships to Walmart. So your sales to Walmart itself. 25 to 100 million. This is more kind of obviously that mid-size range. And then over 100 million, we're considering that kind of large companies, enterprise level. And then the general categories, we have general merchandise, food, and consumables. And if you guys, again, have any questions and maybe want to see how your data stacks up against a particular category, feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to share some data with you guys. So just wanted to give you guys an idea of the average deductions as a percentage of invoices. So overall, on average, we see, and this is kind of crazy, but about 6% of invoices are lost to deductions. So essentially for every $1 that you are invoicing Walmart, about 6 cents is being lost to deductions, which is really, really high. Obviously, for a lot of these folks, this is before working with SupplyPike. This is kind of as they come in, this is the data that we see. Just so you guys have context, generally speaking, we find that best-in-class suppliers usually fall between anywhere between 1 and 3%. Kind of depending on your size, your category, and things like that. Really, really large folks, we will usually see their percentage of invoices are actually less than 1%, but 1 to 3 is pretty darn good. So if you guys fall kind of in that category, you're doing really, really well. But just kind of across the board, 6% is roughly what we see for different folks. The average percent disputed by count, I think, is usually pretty interesting for us. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of context and nuance to this because sometimes there will be valid deductions that you will choose not to dispute. But generally speaking, only about 19% of deductions are ever disputed. I think something that's pretty telling is kind of as the larger the company is, the smaller the percentage drops. And that is pretty normal from what we see, just because the larger you get, the volume starts to get really, really unwieldy. So obviously, you know, we have some folks that we work with that just launched their first PO, their first item ever into Walmart. And, you know, hey, they get 10 deductions a month and they can very easily go and dispute those 10 deductions a month. But, you know, we also work with Fortune 100 companies that are literally getting thousands a week. And so it becomes a little bit unwieldy, and you start to run into situations where folks have dollar thresholds where they'll say, hey, you know, anything under $250, we're not even going to touch because we don't have time. It's not worth our team's time to go after. And so, as you can imagine, there's a lot of opportunity often left on the table. Another interesting call out too is we will see Gen Merch tends to have the highest amount disputed, just because a lot of times, a lot of that is typically invalid. Again, we're speaking in generalities and averages, but most of the time, Gen Merch is kind of lower volume product. It's going to have really, really long, you know, 99-year shelf life. And so usually when they're shipping complete. And so anytime there's a shortage, for example, or a damage, that's probably incorrect. And so they're going after all of these types of deductions. Whereas for consumables and food, higher volume again. So for consumables, it's usually a higher volume category. So can't always get to all of the deductions. And then with food, there's a lot of issues like swell, you know, damages, trailers getting rejected at the door and things like that. So sometimes they aren't as able to, you know, they aren't able to fight as many deductions as the other categories. So again, just some interesting information for you. But again, on average, across all companies, about 19%. So as you can imagine, probably some dollars on the table for everyone out there. I like to pair that stat with this stat because what we have found is for the deductions that people do go after, the win rate is extremely high. So on average, again, there's always going to be nuance. So we do work with suppliers that will dispute everything, even valid deductions. So sometimes that will kind of lessen that win rate. But on average, we see, and you guys can kind of see it's about the same across the board, about 80% of disputed deductions are won. So when suppliers go after invalid deductions, they win them back, which is why it is so important to make sure that you are going after every single one. So even if you're not going to dispute 100%, if you were to dispute 50%, because maybe the other 50% are valid, you are still going to get a really, really high bang for your buck if you have the time and the capacity and the resources to go after every deduction. So just wanted to share that with you guys. Another cool stat for y'all is we find that shortages tend to be the most costly of non-trade Walmart deductions, and they also tend to be the most commonly repaid. So you guys can see here, and this might be true. If this is true, or maybe not true for you guys, please feel free to throw it in the chat if you want to share that insight. But codes 22, 24, and 25, they are our best friends. We know them well just because we see them show up so much. You guys can see here the percentage, again, speaking in averages, but the percentage of deductions that our suppliers get, come from these 3 codes. So obviously these alone are making up a vast majority of these shortage type codes. And then again, if you look at those win rates, you're seeing, an on average 70 to 80% win rates. So if you guys are looking at your data and finding that shortage codes are making up the most of your deductions, really, really, really recommend getting a plan in place to tackling them. Just because, again, when you have the time and capacity and resources to go after shortage codes, there's a really, really high chance that you are going to win those back. So just kind of a pro tip for you guys, again, if you're newer to Walmart and trying to figure out how do I, eat this proverbial elephant, it's one bite at a time. So other kind of cool, interesting notes for you guys. So top 3 codes by count. So overall, so obviously we kind of mentioned shortages. This is for, dollars. So they are the most costly. When we're talking purely for count, codes 22 and 24 still kind of rear their ugly heads. But overall, you'll see codes 94. So this does include kind of those agreements or, expected negotiated allowances. You'll see codes 94s and 60s. So these are returns and then the handling charges that kind of are related to those returns. But code 22, again, a shortage is still there. And a non-agreement, so kind of taking out those allowances and those pricing allowances types of codes, you'll see, again, codes 22 and 24 make up a really, really big portion of deductions for the suppliers that we work with. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just kind of driving that point home, top 3 codes by dollar amount, shocker, codes 22, 25, and 24. So again, those shortage related codes are basically costing our suppliers a lot of money, but again, have a really, really high win rate. So if you've got the ability to, really, really recommend kind of focusing on these to make sure that you are maximizing the amount of money you can get back from Walmart. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, kind of talking about just the average time it takes for our suppliers to dispute. So as we mentioned kind of at the top of the call, Walmart does allow our suppliers to dispute claims up to 2 years back. On average, we are seeing that suppliers take about 140 days, which it's kind of crazy. It's about 4.5 months to go after every deduction that is received, which again is just not great. If you kind of, and we'll share a little bit of information and a little bit on how long it takes Walmart to repay these disputes. And if you kind of look at that in combination, so hey, it's taking Walmart an average of about 3-ish months now to repay those deduction disputes. And then you add the fact that it takes suppliers about 4 months to even get to those disputes, you are about 7 months out from getting any sort of cash inflow from a dispute that you submit. So it's really, really important to try and get deduction disputes out as quickly as you can, just because basically take however long it takes you to get to that dispute, plus however long it takes Walmart to respond to that dispute. And that is how long you have to be able to float cash. So again, this is on average, numbers for folks before coming to work with SupplyPike. So folks that do work with SupplyPike, we're able to usually cut this down to literally 2 to 5 days. But if you guys aren't working with us today, and again, you're curious to say, hey, how well are we doing? This is kind of the industry benchmark right now, about 140 days. And kind of along with that, as I mentioned, the payback timeline. So the total average from submitted to paid, as I mentioned, before the end of settlement was about 51 days, so about 2 months. We've seen that increase to about anywhere between 75 to 90 days recently. And to give you guys, again, a little bit of context there, as we mentioned, settlement was sunset in May. And so Walmart utilizes a third-party team called Genpact to actually review all of the deduction disputes that are sent in and basically make a call on them and then pay them back or not pay them back. So as you can imagine, after Walmart sunset settlement, and suddenly all the very, very, very large suppliers went from these quarterly settlements to having to individually dispute every deduction. And as I mentioned, they can be thousands a week. That backlog for Genpact just grew exponentially from May until now. Now, we do have some pretty interesting stats that they are getting better at working through the disputes, but we have seen disputes open as far back as like December of 2022, January of this year, etc. So just to give you guys an idea of what to expect with timelines. But, generally speaking, again, about 75 to 90 days to get a response. And one thing we haven't seen change from pre-settlement to after settlement is the time to actually get repaid. It's still about 6 days, 6 to 7 days. So once Walmart says, yes, you should get paid back on this dispute, you should see a check come through in about 7 days. You'll notice we called out here about 2% of approved disputes take longer than 14 days to be repaid. So I would really recommend if you guys do have a approved deduction dispute and you have not gotten paid back in more than 14 days, you should raise a case with Walmart's EBS team, their Enterprise Business Solutions team, and they should be able to give you a little bit of guidance there. Okay, so hopefully that is a little bit of helpful context for you guys and just kind of understanding again, maybe where you sit in the grand scheme of Walmart deductions. And, we always like to leave our webinars on a positive note. And as Peter mentioned, we really want to talk through like, hey, all this data is really great and understanding how I'm doing is really great, but like, what do I do with this information? And so, couple of things we'd like to point out at SupplyPike is deductions are not all the same. I think we're noticing a really big evolution in the suppliers that we work with to be a lot more cross-functional and a lot more forward-looking in how folks are looking at deductions and rev loss. I think when we first joined the scene about 4 or 5 years ago, deductions used to be kind of like, oh, that's something that the finance team does. And you get it and you handle it and you deal with it and then you move on. And there wasn't really a way to close that loop, right? So, sales kind of did their thing and supply chain did their thing and finance did their thing and deductions were part of the finance world. And, they wrote it off or they fought it. We don't know. They just do things. But again, a lot of suppliers are beginning to change that mentality and kind of realize that not only should you be working on getting that money back, but also figuring out how you can prevent losing money in the first place. So anytime you get a fine or a chargeback or a deduction, even negotiated ones like we talked about, there is always a possibility that the claim is either valid or invalid. So as we mentioned, there may be scenarios where you really did short ship on an item. You really didn't have enough inventory and that was bad, our bad. We maybe accidentally invoiced in full still. And so when we got a deduction, that was a valid deduction. Yes, that's correct. Walmart should not have paid us in full. But of course, there are also other scenarios where they are invalid and you go like, hey, no, actually we did ship in full and we want to, try and get that money back. So obviously for invalid fines, and that's probably the world that most of us live in and most of us are familiar with, we did ship in full, we should get paid back in full, then the focus is obviously going to be on recovery. So how do we get back that money in a timely manner? How do we make sure we're getting all the right, information in place so that they can pay us back quickly? But I think kind of a newer world order that people are getting used to is there are valid fines sometimes. And how can you focus on preventing them from occurring in the future? So not only getting paid back the money you should be, but also stemming that inflow. Because if not, if you think about it, you're kind of running on a hamster wheel, right? So if you never think about the preventative causes or preventative actions you can take, every month you're just going to get the same types of deductions and you're going to be fighting them and you're just going to be treading water the whole time. So if we can help to kind of decrease the inflow of deductions over time, then recovery becomes a lot more manageable, and you can also start freeing up your team to do a lot of other cool things instead of just like hunting and pecking into APDP and trying to just fight Walmart with every deduction that you get. So generally speaking, kind of the old mindset, as I mentioned, has usually been like, hey, let's just deal with it. Finance team, fight what you can fight, write off what you can write off, and move on. Forward thinkers, kind of suppliers that we're starting to work with, are really starting to change their mindset into thinking, how can we prevent staying sick? Like, let's not stay sick. Let's get off this hamster wheel and figure out how we can improve for the future. Another one, which I completely, absolutely empathize with because I used to be a supplier myself, is that feeling like that retailer is out to get me. They're just looking, Doug McMillon is just sitting in a chair, stroking a cat, trying to figure out ways to find you guys. And of course, we know that that's not true. And instead of having that, like, he's out to get me mindset, kind of using deductions as a signal, right? So anytime you get a deduction or an OTIF fine or a SQEP fine, realizing that these are lagging indicators or signals for something happening further up in your supply chain. So again, that's not always going to be true. There are going to be times where Walmart really did just receive the product incorrectly. But there will definitely be times when, hey, maybe our item setup isn't as clean as we thought it is. And maybe we got this fine because of that. And maybe that should spark a conversation that we have with our data management team, as an example. Again, as I mentioned in the past, it used to just be the finance team. Nowadays, I think we're seeing a lot more collaboration across all teams. And a lot of retailers have kind of forced this collaboration in a way. So again, before with shortage type deductions, it could kind of just live in finance. But nowadays with suppliers getting, for example, OTIF fines and SQEP fines, a lot of finance teams are actually being forced, quote unquote, to work with the warehouse team or work with the supply chain team or work with the planning team to go, hey, we got this OTIF fine. Is that right? Is that wrong? Should I write it off? Should I fight it? Why did we get it? And these types of conversations, as you can imagine, are super, super productive and really important to take suppliers to that next level. And then lastly, kind of a duh, but the old mindset was very reactive, right? So you get that deduction, you fight it, and you kind of react to whatever it is the retailer's throwing your way. Forward thinkers are trying to be a little bit more proactive. So how can they get super educated on topics so that they are prepared for when a program launches or a new rule changes or whatever it is? And a lot of you guys are kind of taking that first step, even by being on this webinar and just trying to get education into what's going on in the supplier world. So when Walmart, Target, Kroger, Amazon changes their mind about something, as they often do, you are kind of prepared for it and ready to take that next step. So we like to kind of think about it in, if you guys took Psych 101 in college, you're probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the metaphor that we have is, for a lot of suppliers, getting paid is kind of the foundation, right? That's table stakes. All of this stuff is really, really great. And really, really cool if you have time to think about them. But kind of step one is getting paid and really establishing a foundation. Does your team understand deductions and fines and chargebacks that they're receiving? And do they understand how to fight those? Because when you do, you can improve cash flow. And when you have a pretty, solid base and solid understanding of that, and you're not just treading water and fighting, every deduction as they come in, you have a strategy and a plan in place, then you can kind of go up into more, higher order thinking, so to speak, of getting better. So how do you start to create and apply strategies, not only for the retailers, one retailer, but across multiple retailers? How do you collaborate and provide visibility across other teams? And then how do you reapply your learnings to other parts of the business? So a lot of newer suppliers we find tend to kind of be in that getting paid mindset. And then as they take time and kind of learn how to be a supplier to Walmart or Target or Kroger or Amazon, because it takes time, then they start, after establishing processes, they can start to think about that getting better piece. So along with that, just wanted to give you guys a couple of pro tips, kind of insights and learnings that we've gotten along the way. Again, as Peter mentioned, we've been around for about 4 or 5 years now, and we live, eat, breathe, sleep deductions and rev loss. So we wanted to share again just some of the learnings that we have gotten along the way that hopefully you guys can apply to your team. I think it's really important from time to time, especially now that we are kind of closing out the year and really starting to think about 2024. Really, really great to just have an audit. If you guys lead a finance team or an accounting team, or even if you lead a sales or supply chain team, kind of really sit down and think about like, what tactics have you guys employed to fight revenue loss? What's working? What's not working? Are you able to get to every deduction that you're receiving? Do you have a dollar threshold for that deduction? What does the days to dispute look like? Are you getting to it the same day? Are you getting to it 6 months later? Do you even know what the retailer's rules are around timelines? So for example, if for Target, you are not getting to it within 18 months, that's dollars that you're writing off. For Amazon, you have 30 days. So how are you prioritizing the retailers that you are working with? I think another really, really big one, and we'll talk a little bit more about this too, is proof documentation. So great, maybe you have a resource and they're primed and ready to go fight your deductions, but do they know where to get proof documentation? Do you know where your bills of lading are stored? Do you know who runs your item management? Do you know who runs your EDI? And obviously, I am asking a lot of very rhetorical questions, but sometimes it's really, really good to take the time again to just take stock. What's been working so far? What hasn't been working so far? Do we have a plan for dealing with revenue loss at these retailers when we know it costs us 6% of every invoice that we are sending over to our retailers? So, when you think about kind of practical applications, I've reframed my mindset. Now what? So, okay, great. Hey, I believe you guys. It shouldn't just be, dealing with it and moving on. We should start to think about how to get better, but how do I actually do that? So, we've kind of laid it out. Obviously, this is a little bit reductive, but, kind of step one is really identifying the major pain points in your company's revenue loss. So you'll find, and I apologize in advance, guys, I'm asking a lot of rhetorical questions, but I think it's, again, designed to spark those questions internally for your own teams. So do you know what your top codes are where you're losing money? And do you know why? Is it in AP deductions? Is it OTIF? Is it SQEP? Is it ORAD? Is it unpaid invoices at Target? Is it co-ops at Amazon? Compliance at Amazon? I think kind of step one is, do you even know where you're losing money? And if you don't, get a plan in place to figure out where we're losing money. Because again, if you understand the rules of the game, you understand where you're losing money, you can kind of start to devise a plan to prevent that and go after that. So once you've kind of figured that out, kind of step two is start to ideate with your team on how to build better processes for identifying root cause and deduction validity. So, number one, you need to have a plan in place to actually go after that money. But then number two, you need to also figure out, okay, let's just say, for example, we figured out that the number one pain point for us is unpaid invoices at Target, as an example. Why is that happening? When are we sending invoices? Does the timing make sense? What is our plan to make sure that we are addressing it? And again, just starting to ask those types of questions. And sometimes it can be outside of your team too, to make sure that, all the right stakeholders are involved. And then once you go, okay, hey, great, we know what the number one pain point is. We know why it's happening and how we can prevent it from happening. Now we actually need to get the required resources in place. So it can be external resources, it can be internal resources. It obviously just kind of depends on what makes the most sense for your company. So very, very common for external sourcing. We work, obviously, SupplyPike, we are a software company. We're not the only ones out there. But, for a lot of folks, they may go, hey, it makes a lot of sense for us to just go ahead and pay someone to do it. We have the budget to do that. So let's go ahead and outsource it. So you can have software, you can have automation, you can rely on companies like SupplierWiki to do third-party education and guidance. Or if you don't want software and automation to kind of superpower your team, you can do true hiring and contract work and go, hey, we don't even want to touch this year. We don't have the time for it. We're just going to completely outsource this to somebody else. Internal processes, some things to think about, as I mentioned, those proof documentation. So do you have a system in place for storing that? Some examples to keep in mind. So, we mentioned, I harp on shortage deductions a lot, again, just because that's usually a really, really big pain point for the suppliers that we work with. But folks oftentimes will utilize companies like UPS or FedEx, and they will actually only store documents for a certain period of time. So I believe like UPS and FedEx are both 90 days, if I'm not mistaken. And so after 90 days, your documents get purged from the system. And so again, kind of, it all comes back, it's full circle here, but if it takes you 90 days or 120 days to get to a deduction, but UPS or FedEx in this example only stores documents for 90 days, by the time you're ready to go after that deduction, that document is gone. And what are you going to do at that point? So do you have a system in place for pulling down documents regularly and making sure that when you are ready to finally go after that deduction, you have what you need? Communication plan for internal teams. So let's just say you guys have learned all these really, really interesting updates about, AP deduction settlement program. Do you have a plan or system in place to communicate that, not only internally, because you have to share it and also have training, but also externally? So if you guys, let's just say, for example, are a prepaid supplier and you work with, 30 different carriers, do they know all the OTIF rules, as an example, or ORAT rules? Do they know when they're supposed to set appointments? Do they know what the MABD windows are? So again, I am beating a dead horse here with the rhetorical questions, but again, hopefully helpful for you guys to start sparking those internal conversations at your office to go, hey, have we thought about this? And maybe you have. And if you've got a whole plan in place, awesome, you are ahead of the curve. But if not, again, just questions you can start asking your teams. So kind of at a high level, when you think about getting paid, just some pro tips for you guys. Make sure you can review any incoming deductions or compliance fines daily or weekly. Compliance fines are going to happen monthly, but deductions, if you're a mid-sized to larger supplier, daily might be the cadence that you have to utilize. If you're smaller, you could probably get away with weekly. Making sure you're familiar with the different portals. So AP deductions is going to be APDP, AR deductions is going to be HighRadius. As I kind of mentioned, if you need to, eat this elephant one bite at a time. So we would recommend focusing on deductions in a particular category or area first, like figuring out what's a low-hanging fruit that you guys can go after. Making sure you're training your team on retailer processes, formulating validity checks to determine invalid deduction. So you get a deduction in, do you know does your team know how to research that deduction to go, no, we shipped this in full, or no, we didn't. And then again, ensuring proof documentation is accessible. So when you are ready to actually go after that deduction, you have, again, everything you need at your fingertips. So it'll take you that 5 minutes rather than 20 minutes to fight every single one. And then on the get better side is, kind of utilizing root cause analysis. So again, this feels like I'm speaking very, very generally. And just so you guys have context, obviously this is something, everything we've talked about so far is stuff that SupplyPike can help with. But we just wanted to give you guys kind of the starting tools if this is something you want to do internally. So just making sure that, you understand again what the root cause is for all of the deductions and compliance fines that you're receiving. So it could be, these are just some examples: carton labeling issues, visibility. Does all your team have understanding into the orders that you're receiving? And then if you're canceling an orders because you're short shipping, does your finance team know that so that they can invoice correctly? Et cetera, et cetera. Proof documentation, master data, PO allocation, EDI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then again, on the getting better piece, it's just making sure that you guys are building processes for working with cross-functional teams, evaluate all leakages and cash flow as connected. So, we kind of mentioned, harkening back to the very early part of the call, if you get a shortage for a PO, you're probably going to get an OTIF fine for that PO. So how are you closing that loop and making sure, if your finance team is going after that shortage, is your supply chain team going after that same OTIF fine for that same PO? Researching root causes as a group wherever you can, implementing corrective actions as a group wherever you can, because you would hate to kind of get to the bottom of an issue and one team implements one corrective action, but no one else knows about it. That's never great. Iterate on implemented processes and applying that framework across all retailer customers. So let's just say, for example, you find a carton labeling issue with Target. Hey, maybe you can apply that same learning to like a package that you're shipping to Walmart or to Kroger, to try and reapply that learning and basically, again, get more bang for your buck. Measuring your success with strategic KPIs that are shared across the company, and then reinvesting that ROI into retailer initiatives. So kind of the hope, obviously, is if you can focus on getting paid and, having a really, really solid foundation there, you can then begin to think about ways you can get better as a company. And then, of course, by your powers combined, and be able to basically have a very, very successful relationship, not only with Walmart, but for all the other retailers you support as well. Okay. Well, I think that is all I have. Peter, I didn't know if I missed anything in the chat or questions. And if not, I'm always happy to share just our contact information in case anyone wants to reach out later.
Yeah, we just had one question really from Pam in the chat, and her question was related to Walmart, and not super specific. She had to hop off too, so we can't ask any kind of qualifying questions, but just kind of about the supplier agreement generally. When they say the amount is over what is on the supplier agreement. So I'd assume that what she's asking about there is something related to maybe returns or something kind of covered in the supplier agreement. But in a more general sense, how do you use the supplier agreement as a way of disputing fines or deductions of any kind?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the supplier agreement, again, if you guys are maybe newer to the space, will outline a lot of kind of the rules that govern your business with Walmart. So for example, you will put your defective allowance in your supplier agreement. And let's just say you agree with your buyer that your defective allowance is going to be 1%. So anything that falls under this particular supplier agreement with a 1% DA, any items that ship under that are basically going to be kind of subject to that 1%. So if I assume from context, and I know you said Pam had to drop off, so hopefully she'll reach back out to us later, but from context, it sounds like she's talking about returns. So if returns are over your agreed upon defective allowance, usually what ends up happening is you will get a post audit for the difference. So basically what's happening is that in this example, Walmart is saying, agreeing with the supplier, hey, we agree on average that about 1% of goods that you ship to me will not be, will be returned, will be unsellable, whatever it is. So supplier, you go ahead and give me a 1% discount for that because we're just going to assume that, there's going to be an issue there. So you agree, Walmart gets a 1% discount. So every time you invoice them, you will just go ahead and give them that 1% discount. What happens though, so let's say in this example that, again, just using context clues. So Pam, if you hear this later and I'm incorrect, please feel free to reach out to us. But let's just say throughout the year, your returns end up being 3% of what you ship to Walmart. Essentially, Walmart can then basically kind of hit you back and basically go, hey, you gave me a 1% discount, but we ended up, getting 3% worth of returns. So we actually weren't able to sell, an additional 2% over the 1% discount. So we're going to need you to basically pay us back for that. And usually that gets issued in the form of a post audit. Now, interestingly enough, sometimes there are situations where the opposite is true, where let's say you have a 1% defective allowance, but your your return only comes in at 0.5%, let's just say. Walmart is actually not necessarily required to true that up with you and go, oh, we actually were able to sell more than we thought. Here's 0.5% back in a check, which, wow, shocker. But usually what a lot of suppliers will do, excuse me, what a lot of suppliers will do is they will kind of use that as like a negotiating chip. So, hey, Walmart, you ended up being able to, you know, sell X dollars more than expected because our returns were so healthy. Could we get a promo next year? Or could you increase our store count? Or could you add an item, etc. So, yeah, hopefully that is helpful. And again, Pam, if I'm incorrect, please feel free to reach out to Peter and I. We want to make sure that we are getting you the right answers that you need. But I think I'm at time, Peter.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's kind of the heart of the issue, is just kind of elaborating on supplier agreements, kind of the role in that process generally is, I think, probably pretty helpful. But yes, these are our emails. So if you see this later on, Pam, or if any of you have any other kind of lingering questions or just kind of ideas for other content, we had a question about Dollar General in the chat. And so it's good for us to know, like, yeah, what are the pain points that you have at other retailers too? What would you like us to cover in the future? All that is really helpful. But yeah, thank you so much, Stacy. It was really great hearing from you on that subject today. And we'll see you all next time.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Bye.